Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today, I'm going to be talking about modern versus vintage sports cards and the collecting of both. And this is a topic that's been touched on many times by other people, but I'm going to talk about it as just a collector of both. And this topic came up to me because I had a few questions of my mail days recently as why I've not had many vintage cards on my mail days. It's been very 90s focused, or King Griffey Jr. focused, or Frank Thomas focused, but not a lot of vintage cards. And I want to go through some of my rationale on why I'm buying a lot more 90s cards, and why you're not seeing as many vintage cards in my breaks or in my mail days. And I just want to go a little bit into some of what I'm seeing in valuation and investing in the 90s. And again, I'm not an investing in sports cards channel, so I'm not here to give you advice on what you should be buying or what you should be buying. This is what I collect. What I'm going to be talking about as far as just pricing is where I'm talking about, is it going up? Is it going down? Is it going to be smoothing out? Now, this topic has been covered quite a bit. Other channels have talked about vintage versus modern. Scotty B Cards, and you've got Jeff Wilson doing it. So I do feel like, this topic has been done a little bit. Even Reserved Investments did a video on it 3 years ago, right? So it's a very common topic in the hobby. Vintage cards are safe investments or safe purchases. Modern cards are something that appeal to the younger collector, and therefore they're going to turn into the vintage cards of tomorrow. But the cards I buy is 90s cards, and they fall into a mid category, which I consider to be, they're old enough that they have a fan base that isn't young, but they're new enough that these old school collectors, the really hardcore guys from the 80s that are still around, don't really think of them as old or close to vintage. They view them as still like modern cards. So there's and I talked about it in another video, like kind of like the weirdness of the eras and ages of cards. The 90s cards to me are 30 plus years old, but they're still not considered to be vintage, but they're not considered modern. So they're in that weird mid category, I feel. Now, as far as what I think about pricing, I'm just going to use two cards as examples of why, I am not worried about pricing either way. This card just sold, the 60 Hank Aaron in a PSA 8. I own this card in a PSA 8. So fair weather warning. This is why I was tracking this card. It just sold at auction today for about $3,600. The previous card sold for $3,700 in Heritage. And then a year ago, this card, didn't sell a year ago, but 2 years ago, it was selling for $3,500. So pretty steady, maybe slight increase versus 2 years ago. But the card had a previous high of $6,300 in a one-off auction on Heritage, but it had a couple sales over $4,000. I remember that GM Cards 2 sell, thinking that was an interesting sell because that was off eBay. Then it came down a little bit from 4,000 to 37 to 36. But to me, it's holding its own. To me, it's very flat. And if you look at this graph, it looks pretty flat, right through here. This isn't big swings in value. Go to my cards I collect, the 90s cards, and you've got this King Griffey Jr. refractor, and you can see very flat graph there. And just look at the prices. The last one sold October 5th for $4,400. Ignore the one weird PWCC sell, and the one before it was 45. The one before it was 45. The one before that was 46, 47, then 4,022. So, between a year over year, it's like basically flat to a slight increase, maybe you could say. But in general, it's very steady. So two cards that are, to me, really good examples of high-end demand, high-quality vintage and modern, or 90s cards. You want to call them 90s cards versus modern. And you've got pretty much flat pricing for two cards that are in high demand. Super high demand for these two cards. A lot of people want or need these cards. So if it was a bear market where no confidence, these cards would probably go down like the rest of the market. If it was a boom market, these cards would be the kind of some of the first to go up. I think we're just holding steady. It's flat. So my point there is that there's no financial incentive at all for me to collect one thing over the other. So money has nothing to do with what I'm doing in terms of why I'm buying more 90s and King Griffey Jr. cards versus vintage cards. It's not because I'm thinking one is going to go up a lot more than the other. I do think, in general, a lot of 90s cards have been severely underpriced and are just now becoming more collectible. I'm seeing auctions of like Mike Piazza and Chipper Jones, what I call like the second to third tier players from the 90s, starting to bring more value. But again, we're talking hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars, right? You know, the Mike Piazza was selling for $200, now it's selling for $400, right? It's doubling in price, but just dollar value, it's not significantly higher in total cash. So you can still afford some of those cards. That's all I want to say is like the 90s cards are still affordable for a lot of these players outside of maybe Griffey and a few other players. So that's a big factor in my case is that, you know, they're affordable. They're something I can go after and they're not breaking the bank right now. And unfortunately, and the real reason I'm not buying a lot of vintage cards is because I'm to the point with my vintage card collecting is I need a lot of big cards. So I want to talk about that a minute. You know, the idea of, collecting vintage cards versus modern cards in my collection and where I'm at. So I have spent a majority of my collecting time from 1997, 1998, when I first got back into or started collecting graded cards, which started me collecting vintage cards again. I've been on that journey ever since then. So you could say, you know, since the, let's say, late 90s to early 2000s, I was virtually only collecting vintage cards for the most part. I had some Griffey cards. There was always some of that modern stuff always going on in my collection. And then there was that one period where I was doing a lot of pirate modern stuff. But outside of that, it's always been vintage collecting. And my vintage collection has started to really solidify in terms of cards I really still want and need. Now, you know, I don't have every vintage set. I don't have every vintage player. It's not like that. But the players I collect, like Clemente, you know, I've completed my base set. I just picked up his 3D, 68 3D, which is sort of the biggest Clemente card out there. I'm pretty advanced in my Clemente collection. I don't need to pick up a lot more of his cards because I just have gotten so many of them. And that the ones I do still need are super rare and hard to find. So I'm not going to be getting those very often. Same way for Hank Aaron and Willie Mays. I only need a few of those cards. And the ones I do need outside of one or two are pretty rare or expensive. So on Willie Mays this year, I did pick up a 55. So I just picked up a 56 Aaron in the National. So I have moved the needle on those collections quite a bit. And I have sort of, you know, backed off on my Chief Bender collection, even though there is one card I really want to get of Bender this year that I'm still trying to kind of finagle a way into that card through some trading and selling of some other cards. It's a big card, so I definitely am trying to get into that card. But other than that, you know, there's just a few of these cards that I really am going after and need. I did pick up another Hank Aaron card this week. So it's the first vintage purchase I've had in probably over a month, honestly, you know, maybe even longer, maybe since the National. So there's, you know, I think that is, you know, a big factor for me in how I collect is that I have a lot of the cards I really want or need. And it's because I've been doing it for so long. I've only really started focusing on 90s cards in the last year or so, outside of Griffey. And my Griffey collection really didn't start until in high gear until about 2019 to 2020. So I've been collecting hardcore Griffey only for about 3 or 4 years. So if you compare that to the amount of time I've collected vintage cards, it's a very minute amount of time comparatively. And so there's just a lot more cards available to collect that I want and still need. I just shared in my top 5 refractor set video my Griffey refractor checklist and how many cards I still need. I think I need like 71 cards still to complete all the 90s Griffey refractors. So I still have a lot of cards there to try to go out and find. So it's really about the fact that I just need a lot more, or I'm interested in getting a lot more 90s cards than vintage cards because of just the maturity of the two collections. And I think as a collector, that's what happens a little bit over time is, you either shift focus or just one collection becomes so advanced, like so complete, that you just quit adding to it as often as other collections. And I think that's perfectly normal. And that's a very collector thing to have happen. And I will tell you, like, what started happening with vintage was I started getting doubles and triples of cards because I like the cards. Like a good example is like 71 Tops. I really like 71 Tops. And all of a sudden I've got 2 Pete Roses, 2 Johnny Benches, 2 Ernie Banks, 3 Nolan Ryans. And it's like, do I really need triples and doubles of these cards? Or should I sell them and buy other cards I need? And so I did that. And so for a little bit of time, last year and a little bit this year, I did sell some of my vintage doubles. And I've been doing more of that than I have been buying more vintage doubles, right? And buying more vintage. I still have a long ways to go in my collecting goals, for sure. I'm not anywhere near complete on a lot of my sets, but and I do have a lot of cards I need to throw on Comp C and move and to buy other cards. So that's still a lot of stuff happening. I'm organizing my collection as well. One thing I still don't have is a lot of checklists of players and cards I still need for certain things I'm building. Like for example, I put together a 63 top set that I'm over 50% completed on that I know of, but I don't have an updated checklist. I don't know which cards I still need. So I need to go through and make a checklist on that so I can finish that set. I've been working on that for a lot of years. So it's just, that is sort of where I'm at. And I want to make sure people understood it wasn't because I'm not interested in collecting vintage anymore, or that I think 90s cards are better investments. It's just because of where I'm at from I call it maturity or just advancement in those two collections. So, and I would encourage anyone that, if you're, and I do feel this sometimes where I feel like, oh, I'm buying too much of one thing and not another because I collect a lot of different things. That's a perfectly normal feeling for collectors. And, it's kind of like listening to your gut. And if you feel like your collection is getting unbalanced or only going in one direction, it's fine to change, to switch your focus, collect something else for a while, because that keeps me interested. Keeps you interested. And I know for a fact that I am very energized about collecting right now because I've been buying a lot of cool sets that I didn't really recognize in the 90s as being either so cool or so rare. And now I'm almost rediscovering these cards that I knew about, but I didn't ever collect when I could have. And that makes it like a treasure hunt. Finding cool sets and cool cards that I didn't know much about. I'm learning about these sets and their condition issues or their rarity or the variations within the sets or how they were distributed or, just a lot of little things like that. And that makes it a lot of fun. It's like, it's a good way to learn. It's kind of, and then in some of the videos I've been doing, I've been trying to take some of that knowledge and share it back with the larger community. So it's been a lot of fun for me to do that. And I think, honestly, if I was only collecting vintage right now, like if that was my only collecting focus, I probably would have taken a lot of hiatuses, or just had a lot of periods of time where I wasn't really collecting much, or just lost a lot of interest because of how mature those, and I just have so many of those cards that I don't feel like I need to go out and just keep getting more and more of the same cards, right? So I think it's kept me being, focused and energized and into it, and being part of the community, and having fun, because, again, you saw my video from the National, like I picked up a giant vintage card there. And that sort of like, was the cherry on top of the cake for me this year for vintage cards. Like, I'm not going to top that. I'm not going to get me a vintage card this year that's better than that 68 3D Calente. It's just not going to happen. So, that's just, that kind of like, that was it. That was like kind of like my year is done. I don't need any more vintage cards. I conquered a pretty big hill or mountain with that card. So that's it, guys. I just want to share that with you, and kind of share with me your thoughts on how you kind of balance, if you collect more than just one type of, era or sport, and do you feel like you have to rebalance your collection sometimes, or you get a little more one way or the other in terms of focus? And, and do you feel like you have to kind of change your habits a little bit because of that? Right now, again, I'm going to be collecting a lot of 90s cards for the foreseeable future, but I do have a very cool vintage card coming in the mail, so I'll share that with you guys when it comes in. But until then, I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.